Hello, Bible readers. It is Friday, February 19th. We're reading from 2 Chronicles chapters 10 to 12, 1 Kings chapter 15, and 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17 to 8:13. I'm going to start at 1 Corinthians, page 868 of my commentary, because as we get into chapter 7, there's some hard stuff, like why is Paul going there? What's happening here? And so I thought I'd read you kind of how these first 7 chapters are shaped. The first 4 chapters regrounds the Corinthians in the core of the gospel, reminds them of who they are in relationship to that gospel and to the world, and calls them to end their fractiousness, their brokenness. The other building blocks are chapters 5 and 6. They too offer a lesson in fundamentals, rehearsing the nature of community, identifying how believers differ from the world and worldly practices, attempting to clarify what's appropriately treated within the community and what should be left outside of it. But then we get into a more specific issue, right? And once we get into all these, this conversation that Paul has about sex, what we might call sexuality, the commentary says, from the lengthy treatment of marriage and sexuality issues in chapter 7, we can surmise that the Corinthians are divided in their understandings of how the life of faith bears on sexual matters. So that's how scholars determine, what were the questions at the time? What's popping up in the community? Well, obviously, from how much time and effort Paul devotes to this specific question, this must have been a problem. So then it goes on to say, maybe Paul's celibacy is being taken as a norm for all believers. Paul frequently offers himself as an example, and maybe that contributed to this misunderstanding about sex matters. In chapter 7, we're not confronted with an asceticism that's crept into the congregation, as some have suggested, but a good faith effort on the part of some to respond to Paul's call for holiness. That's the thing. Paul's been calling for holiness. He's been saying, be upright people. And so now people are wondering, so does that mean we're supposed to be celibate? Or so then he speaks to these different socio-sexual groups, and he maps out a preferred or better course. For each, he also lifts up an alternative, concessionary but still acceptable route. So, okay, here widower, here married person, here single person, here's the best course forward, and here's an alternative. But the key to understanding all this, and really all of Paul's letters, the key to understanding all of it is Paul's imminent expectation of the end of the world. Paul is uniformly and steadfastly convinced that God's on the brink of finishing up the creation's restoration. Because Paul expects the end so directly, he repeatedly counsels the Corinthians to remain as you are. That's really important for us to realize, that Paul is coming from a place that he thinks Jesus is going to return again for the second time soon. And so just stay as you are. If you're married, be married. If you're not, don't. I guess that's all I'll talk about here so far. Then we get into 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. And 1 Kings is kind of stuff that comes after what we're reading in 2 Chronicles. So I'll just start in 2 Chronicles. We start with the king who would not listen, Rehoboam. His reign is presented as a spiritual roller coaster. Sometimes he's doing the right thing, other times he isn't. In chapter 10, he listens, and then he doesn't. But in chapter 11, when ready to attack, he stops before he starts because he listens. So there's the roller coaster. Chapter 12, once he sets up all the defenses for Jerusalem, for the southern kingdom, he grows strong and abandons God's laws. And by the end of our text for today, he dies, and we're almost ready for Abijah, which is where our 1 Kings text picks up. The reign of Abijah, not great. And then it's the reign of Asa. He's a mixed bag, He brings gifts to the temple, and he removes treasure from it. Then you got Nadab, who only rules for 2 years in Israel, killed while attacking the Philistines. And then you get Baasha, 24 years, but evil, walking in the way of Jeroboam. You never want to be described as walking in the way of Jeroboam. Last thing I'm going to say, just notice there are, don't forget, northern kings, that's Israel, and there are southern kings that are either described as ruling Jerusalem or Judah, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Two different kings. We're in a divided kingdom. I am one with my God. My God is with us, all of us, at all times and in all places.